Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping right into the source material you pulled together for June 11th, 2025.
Right.
Looking through it, it's pretty clear this was a day packed with significant developments, both here in the US and, well, across the globe.
Yeah,
It really lays bare just how interconnected everything is.
absolutely. And our mission with these sources is really to take this comprehensive picture you've provided,
Yeah.
covering everything from domestic tensions, global conflicts, economic shifts, sectoral changes, social stuff, and really zero in on the most important pieces.
Want the key insights.
Exactly. Pull out those nuggets of knowledge and insight for you.
Okay, let's start right here at home then, because the sources paint a pretty intense picture. The big headline for many seemed to be the situation around immigration and protests.
Yeah, what really stands out is the focus on Los Angeles. It was already in its fifth straight day of escalating protests against the immigration crackdown.
Fifth day, wow.
And the local response was significant. Mayor Karen Bass put a curfew in place, and the police made nearly 200 arrests even before that curfew took effect. 197 to be exact.
Nearly 200 before the curfew, and that's where things really escalated with the federal response.
Right. President Trump ordered in serious backup, an additional 2,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines sent to L.A.
That's a lot of personnel, and the cost attached to that deployment.
Steep. The estimate mentioned was $134 million.
$134 million, which brings up this fascinating tension, doesn't it, between federal and state authority?
Definitely. California's governor, Gavin Newsom, he was quick to push back hard.
How so?
Well, he called the deployment a deliberate attempt to create disorder and chaos. He actually tried to stop it legally.
Did that work?
A judge postponed the decision on that, so no immediate halt.
And the language being used wasn't exactly calming things down.
Not at all. President Trump described protesters using terms like animals and alien enemies, and he threatened to use every resource.
Even mentioning the Insurrection Act.
Yeah, floating that possibility, which is, a significant thing to mention.
It really is. That's the act that could potentially let the president deploy the military domestically, bypassing state control.
Exactly. And the sources show this wasn't just an LA story either.
Right. It spread.
Protests popped up in cities like New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Austin, Dallas, Philadelphia, San Antonio, Seattle, Denver, Omaha, even Brookhaven, Georgia, and D.C.
So a nationwide response and significant police action elsewhere, too.
Yeah, definitely. New York had over 80 arrests mentioned, San Francisco over 150. So substantial numbers.
And there's another angle here, maybe less obvious, the link to labor unions.
Right. The Department of Justice actually charged David Huerta. He's the president of SEU-USWW, the big service workers union out west, with conspiracy to impede an officer.
That sounds serious. What kind of penalty does that carry?
Maximum sentence is 6 years.
Wow. What happened to him?
Huerta was apparently injured during his arrest, but he was later released on bail. And his situation, it really highlights how involved the labor movement is in this fight for immigrant rights.
So other unions backed him up.
Oh, yeah. Big names like Unite Here, the Teamsters, the UAW, the AFL-CIO, they all voice support. It shows this growing intersection, maybe sometimes a collision, between labor rights and immigrant worker protections.
So when you put all this together, the federal intervention, the state pushback, the sheer scale of the protests, the labor involvement, it really reveals some fundamental tensions, doesn't it?
Absolutely, between federal power and states' rights, for one, and also about the limits of civil liberties during times of unrest.
Yeah, I mean, when you see the military potentially being deployed domestically against protesters like this, what are the potential long-term implications for you listening? How might that change how dissent is handled?
Well, it could definitely set a precedent, for how the federal government steps into state-level issues tied to federal policy. It could shift the whole landscape of domestic order, that balance of power between D.C. and the states.
Okay, let's shift then. From the streets to the courts and regulatory actions, June 11th had some major developments there, too.
Yeah, this is where we saw a movement on some really high-profile cases, like President Trump's criminal conviction appeal in the hush money case.
It was being heard where?
Federal appeals court in Manhattan. His team was arguing that the case should be moved to federal court based on presidential immunity.
Right, the idea that actions taken while president are sort of protected.
Exactly. And what was really notable in the sources was that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, actually filed a brief supporting Trump's request.
The DOJ supported the transfer. That's interesting.
It is. And even the judges acknowledged how unprecedented the whole case is.
First time a former president convicted of criminal charges. So whatever happens with the appeal, it's new legal ground.
Definitely charting new territory. Meanwhile, another major legal story. Harvey Weinstein.
Ah, yes. His second sex crimes conviction in New York. The first one was overturned.
Right. And this time, the verdict was split. Guilty on one count, the one related to Miriam Haley.
But not others.
Acquitted on another count related to Kaja Sokola,
Yeah.
and the jury was hung, couldn't reach a verdict on a third-degree rape charge related to Jessica Mann.
So a mixed outcome, but still facing significant time.
Up to 25 years on that conviction. And he's also appealing a separate conviction from California back in 2022.
In this case, I mean, it's still so deeply connected to the #MeToo movement, right?
Absolutely. It continues to highlight just how challenging these sexual assault cases can be to prosecute, especially around issues of consent and, witness credibility.
Okay, shifting from courts to executive power, President Trump signed some executive orders on June 11th.
3 of them, yeah. Focused on a few key areas.
Yeah.
Speeding up domestic drone production,
Like tax codes, okay.
enhancing U.S. airspace security, and trying to regain leadership in supersonic technology.
Supersonic flight, interesting. What was the administration's pitch on these?
Well, Michael Kratzios said they were designed to cut through decades of regulatory gridlock.
So speeding things up, how?
They included launching a pilot program for drone operations beyond the operator's line of sight and testing for flying cars, EVTLs they call them.
Flying cars, like for real.
Well, electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, potential uses from emergency services, maybe military logistics.
Huh.
And they also put measures in place to counter illegal drone activities for national security.
So this is a big push into high-tech aviation.
Clearly, it could really reshape the industry.
Right.
But, it also brings up big questions.
Like
How quickly can regulation keep up, ensuring safety? And privacy concerns, obviously, as drones and maybe even flying cars become more common.
Yeah, good points. And maybe the most attention-grabbing announcement that day involved FEMA.
Ah, yes. President Trump announced plans to phase out FEMA.
Phase out the Federal Emergency Management Agency entirely.
By the end of hurricane season, that was the plan, transferring its responsibilities back to the states.
What was the justification given?
Trump's reasons were that FEMA is poorly managed, too expensive, and, quote, not doing its job. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem is apparently setting up a review council for this.
But wait, can a president just phase out an agency like FEMA?
That's the crucial point the sources stressed. Getting rid of FEMA entirely, or even just reallocating its funds, requires congressional approval.
Okay, so Congress has to sign off.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine there was pushback.
Oh, yeah. Predictably, Democrats voiced strong opposition, warning it could leave Americans vulnerable during disasters.
So for you listening, just think about this. If FEMA were phased out, how might that fundamentally change things? The country's capacity to respond to, say, a massive hurricane or earthquake?
And what would the burden look like for the states?
Yeah.
Especially those maybe with fewer resources or less infrastructure.
It could lead to a real patchwork system, couldn't it, where your recovery depends heavily on which state you live in?
Exactly. Potentially creating huge disparities. This isn't just about disaster relief structure. It's really about a fundamental ideological fight over the role of the federal government.
Let's touch on the economy now. The sources from June 11th mention the White House pushing a specific narrative.
Yeah, the White House was claiming that America is defeating inflation under President Trump.
How are they backing that up?
They pointed to data from May, said inflation was lighter than expected, and that core inflation was the lowest since March 2021, coming in at 2.0% annually.
Okay, a 2.0%. And anything about wages?
Yeah, they highlighted positive signs there too. Real wage growth for production and non-supervisory workers, highest monthly increase in almost a year, they said, which meant about a 2% year-over-year increase.
And specific price drops?
Mentioned declines in energy, gasoline, also meat, airline tickets, cars, clothing, sectors like that.
So this is clearly the administration using specific data points.
Right, strategically, to build confidence and frame their economic policies as successful in taming inflation.
But then you see how a single policy decision can have these, ripple effects on everyday things. The example here was the new steel tariff.
Yeah, a new 50% tariff on imported steel, also announced around this time.
And how does that connect to, say, groceries?
Well, what's fascinating is how this tariff, aimed at helping the steel industry, could directly hit the price of a can of soup or vegetables. The Wall Street Journal noted steel can prices could jump 9% to 15%.
9 to 15%. So what does that mean for a typical can?
Maybe an 18 to 30-cent increase on a $2 can, something like that.
Why such a direct hit?
Because the U.S. apparently produces very little of the specific tin-coated sheet steel used for cans. About 3/4 of it is imported, mostly from Europe and Canada.
Oh, okay. And this isn't just about slightly pricier groceries, is it?
No. The Consumer Brands Association warned that if these costs get passed on, and maybe consumers buy fewer canned goods or companies switch packaging, it could put up to 20,000 U.S. food canning jobs at risk.
20,000 jobs.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So the steel tariff story is like a perfect little example of the complex, often unintended consequences of these kinds of trade policies.
Right. Trying to help one industry might hurt another down the line.
Exactly. Hurts others, impacts consumers, reveals these conflicts between different American jobs and interests. It just shows how policy hits things you buy every week.
Okay, let's move beyond U.S. borders now. June 11th also put a spotlight back on several persistent global challenges.
Yeah. The situation in Ukraine, for instance, still unresolved. President Trump's self-imposed 2-week deadline for Russia to end the conflict. It passed. No breakthrough.
And Trump's view on Putin.
Interestingly, Trump reportedly admitted he believes Putin doesn't care about the human cost of the war.
So what was the U.S. response after the deadline passed? More sanctions? More aid?
Didn't seem like it. No new sanctions announced. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth actually suggested a reduction in U.S. military assistance, emphasizing a negotiated solution instead.
A reduction in aid. Did Trump talk to Putin again?
Apparently once since the deadline, but the sources just said nothing came of it. And there were still reports of recent drone attacks in Ukraine.
So this really highlights the difficulty in finding a resolution and maybe a continued shift in the U.S. approach.
Could be. Perhaps reflecting that America first focus on reducing direct military commitments abroad.
Okay, another long-standing issue, the Iran nuclear deal. Any movement there?
Trump seemed less optimistic about reaching a deal, citing Iran's insistence on uranium enrichment.
So talks ongoing.
New negotiations were scheduled, yes. The U.S. was waiting for Iran's response to its latest proposal. And this is all happening as another deadline, one Trump said back in April, also expired this week.
So still a stalemate.
Pretty much. A symptom of deep mistrust on both sides. And frankly, if no deal is reached, it carries, significant potential for instability, escalation around Iran's nuclear program.
Right. And then down in Gaza.
Negotiations to end the war were reportedly deadlocked. And sources noted President Trump's frustration with Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu was deepening.
And the human cost just continues.
Starkly visible. There was a tragic event mentioned on June 11th itself. 36 Palestinians killed while seeking aid.
Just awful. Were aid efforts still happening?
Yeah, efforts continue. Some activists reportedly organized under Greta Thunberg's leadership, oddly enough, and a convoy was mentioned reaching Libya, trying to get to Gaza by sea to bypass the blockade.
It just underscores the severity, doesn't it? The humanitarian crisis, the aid blockades, the civilian casualties, the political pressure.
Immense pressure on all sides, and adding another layer of complexity right within the region. Netanyahu's government in Israel was facing a serious crisis.
Oh, what's happening there?
The opposition was pushing to dissolve the Knesset, the Israeli parliament.
Why?
Because ultra-Orthodox coalition partners were threatening to bolt, to withdraw their support.
Over what issue?
Over the government's failure to pass a law exempting them from compulsory military service, especially after rabbis issued a religious decree against serving.
The draft exemption issue. That's always been divisive in Israel, right?
Incredibly divisive. And even more so now, during this long Gaza war. Tragically, 866 Israeli soldiers have been killed since October 7th, 2023, according to the source.
So the war is making these internal divisions even worse.
Exactly. And it raises the question, could a government collapse or early elections actually change the direction or intensity of the Gaza conflict?
That's a huge question. Internal political instability could definitely impact military strategy and diplomacy.
Especially during wartime, absolutely.
Okay, let's look at some key bilateral and regional things from the sources on June 11th. U.S.-China trade talks, some progress there.
Yes, officials reportedly reached a consensus on a trade framework after talks in London.
A framework? What did it involve?
The plan was for Commerce Secretary Lutnick and Trade Representative Greer to present it to Trump. And apparently, it included China agreeing to approve rare earth mineral exports.
Okay, that's big.
And the U.S. potentially rolling back some restrictions on tech exports.
This is the kind of news investors watch closely.
For sure. But the sources also cautioned about how fragile these things can be, pointing to how quickly a similar deal collapsed earlier in Switzerland.
Right, so maybe a step towards de-escalation, but still volatile.
Exactly. High risk of things unraveling quickly.
Okay, moving over to South Asia. Tensions between Pakistan and India flared up.
Yeah, Pakistan warned India against violating the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty.
The Water Treaty, what specifically was said?
Pakistan's foreign minister, Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, he accused India's FM of behaving like a warmonger, pushed back on terrorism claims, and crucially stated that any threat by India to stop river water flow under that treaty would be seen as an act of war.
An act of war, that's strong language. And this comes after.
After a military conflict between them just back in May, ended with a ceasefire brokered by the U.S. and allies.
Right. And it's worth noting, the head of USCNECOM recently called Pakistan an extraordinary partner in counterterrorism.
So this situation, it just underscores the fragile peace between these two nuclear powers. Any escalation, whether it's water or terrorism accusations, carries huge risks.
And it shows how complex the U.S. balancing act is between the two.
Definitely trying to balance relationships there.
And finally, on the regional front, signals that the Sudan civil war might be drawing in more players.
Yeah, the Sudanese army retreated from a really strategic spot, that Libya-Egypt-Sudan border triangle.
Why did they retreat?
They claimed forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar, the Libyan commander, attacked them there, and that Haftar's forces were working with the RSF, the paramilitary group fighting the Sudanese army.
And there were allegations about weapons.
The Sudanese army alleged that the RSF and Haftar used this corridor for weapons transfers, though Haftar's forces denied being involved.
So this withdrawal is kind of a worrying sign, suggests the conflict is spreading.
Yeah, it suggests regionalization, involvement of external players like those linked to Haftar. That border region is critical for arms routes, and its instability could easily spill over, destabilize neighboring countries even more.
It just shows how these conflicts can get so tangled, drawing in regional powers.
Affecting broader security, absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears one last time. Sectoral and social developments from June 11th. Tech and business had some interesting items.
Apple made several announcements. New features for AirPods, updates to their services.
The usual updates.
Yeah, and expanding their car keys integration to 13 new vehicle brands.
Just shows the constant evolution of their ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
And the competition in that whole tech integration space.
Exactly. But one story really highlighted a darker side, a new area of crime, crypto crime.
What was this one?
High-profile case in Manhattan. 2 crypto investors pleaded not guilty to charges that included kidnapping for Bitcoin.
Kidnapping for Bitcoin? Seriously?
Yeah. Prosecutors claimed the victim faced violence, coercion, but the defense argued photos and videos showed the victim laughing and smiling, suggesting it was maybe consensual.
But there was evidence.
A loaded handgun and a chainsaw were found. And prosecutors apparently believe these guys might have done similar things before.
Wow. So regardless of how this specific case turns out,
It demonstrates that digital assets, like Bitcoin, are becoming targets for serious, even violent organized crime. It's forcing law enforcement to develop new expertise.
and highlights the need for better security if you hold digital wealth.
Definitely. Speaking of organized crime, a Texas man, Carlos Martinez, got a heavy sentence.
What for?
11 years and a $2 million fine for monopolizing the transmigrant shipping industry near the Los Indios border.
Transmigrant shipping. What's that?
Basically helping people transport goods across the border. But he had links, son-in-law of a former Gulf cartel leader.
So cartel links.
Yeah. His operation involved price fixing, extortion, collected over $9.5 million money laundering, and he used intimidation and violence, kidnapping, beatings, armed attacks against competitors.
Just shows the real local impact of these transnational crime networks, exploiting legitimate industries at the border.
And the challenge of tackling them. Then a really significant development with potentially huge implications. The U.S. seeing what's being called a reboot of nuclear power.
A nuclear reboot? Why now?
Reportedly driven by a couple of things. Surging energy demand, especially from AI data centers,
AI's energy needs, right?
and competition with China. Plus, it's backed by private investment and seems to have enthusiasm from the Trump administration.
Who's investing?
Tech giants, actually, like Microsoft and Meta, apparently looking at reviving operational reactors or even decommissioned ones.
And the military's interested too.
Heavily, specifically in small reactors for ships and bases. They're planning deployments in remote places, the Arctic Pacific Islands, The Pentagon's Innovation Unit even awarded contracts to 8 companies for microreactors on military bases.
This is huge. Potential for energy infrastructure, decarbonization, energy independence.
It's a fascinating convergence. Tech needs, defense strategy, energy policy, all pushing towards nuclear.
Definitely a major potential shift to watch. Okay, moving on to some other notable news from June 11th. Mississippi had a new seafood labeling law.
Yeah, House Bill 602 takes effect July 1st, 2025. Requires all seafood and crawfish sold in the state to be clearly labeled imported or domestic.
Who oversees that?
Joint oversight. The state's Department of Agriculture and Commerce and the Department of Marine Resources
Seems like part of that trend towards consumer transparency, right? Knowing where your food comes from.
could potentially boost local buying too, support the state's industry.
Then in North Mississippi, a healthcare access issue.
Yeah, for folks with United Healthcare, Medicare Advantage, PPO, and HMO plans. As of June 1st, North Mississippi Health Services facilities and providers went out of network.
Why?
NMHS terminated their agreements with United Healthcare.
Ouch. That's tough for beneficiaries. Means higher costs or finding new doctors.
Exactly. Really puts a spotlight on those ongoing policy discussions about network adequacy and managed care plans, and the disruptions when these deals break down.
Also, a new study on gun violence came out.
Yeah, with some concerning findings. It showed thousands more child deaths from gun violence in states with looser firearm laws, specifically after that 2010 Supreme Court decision.
And states with stricter laws.
Places like California, Maryland, New York, Rhode Island, they actually saw declines in child gun deaths.
It just reinforces that firearms are the leading cause of death for kids and teens in the U.S.
And highlights the real impact gun laws seem to have on vulnerable populations.
Okay, and finally, on our positive note, some sports recognition.
Yeah. Jackson State's football coach, T.C. Taylor, was named Black College Football Coach of the Year.
That's great. Follows their championship season, right?
Yeah, 2024 champs. Multiple SWAC titles, Celebration Bowl win, real success there.
And another Mississippi University.
William Carey University Athletics earned a top 5 spot nationally in the NAIA for the 2nd year running, and named best in their conference, the SSAA, for the 9th straight year.
Nice.
And that Jackson State Award, it really highlights the growing prominence and success of HBCU athletic programs nationally.
Wow. Okay. Just looking back at everything we covered from just this one day, June 11th. I mean, protests in LA, trade deals in London, legal battles, executive orders on drones and FEMA, inflation claims, tariffs on cans.
Conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, Pakistan-India tensions, crypto crime, the nuclear reboot.
It really does feel like a snapshot of a period of intense transformation, doesn't it? Political, social, economic.
Absolutely. And it shows how all these things are connected. Domestic tensions, global challenges, economic pressures, tech changes. They all influence each other, influence governance, global stability, even our daily lives.
Often in ways that aren't immediately obvious.
Exactly. And these aren't just isolated incidents. They're developments with potentially significant long-term consequences.
Impacting the cost of goods, disaster preparedness, the future of energy, digital safety.
Everything.
So as you listening, process all this information from your sources today. Maybe think about this. Given the sheer diversity and complexity of everything we covered, from federal troops in cities to global water disputes, from a former president's legal status to the reboot of nuclear power, how does seeing all these seemingly disparate events together change your perspective? What are the most critical areas you think need attention or adaptation in the coming months? What connection did you see weaving through all of this?